It's time for the tactics meeting. I'm your host, Dan Smiley, and here on the podcast, we talk about response tactics and technology. And I'm excited to have Brian MacDonald from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Brian, I've worked with you in drills for years now and have been remiss at getting you on the podcast to talk about wildlife response and your experience as the wildlife branch director. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. You were down with us at the communications workshop in Portland a few weeks ago, where we spent a pretty good amount of time talking about wildlife response and messaging during wildlife response. What did you get anything out of that?
I did. Just part of I think what I got was just how passionate the communicators are in trying to get the right information out, and that was a really nice observation for me to make, and realize that we're all trying to help each other out there, and we've all got jobs to do, and making sure that we get the right information to those people to get it distributed out properly is a really important thing to do.
So, Brian, you've been with Department of Fish and Wildlife for a long time, and in the Washington or on the Northwest Area Contingency Plan, it really hands the ball for wildlife response over to Fish and Wildlife. You or one of your colleagues would most likely be the branch director for the wildlife branch. And so today I was hoping we might talk about what you felt like the role of that branch director was. We've had Focus Wildlife and International Bird Rescue, both well respected organizations, come on and talk about wildlife capture and rehabilitation, but the management of wildlife response is a whole nother topic. So what do you see as the primary responsibilities of the wildlife branch director?
I think the primary responsibility is to serve as the interface between the incident command and those wildlife contractors to make sure that they're getting the resources that they need, to make sure that the unified command is getting the information back that they require, really to fill that administrative role that kind of connects the two together. Those organizations do wonderful work. I see our responsibility as being able to provide the resources they need to do that work and to focus on that.
Can you give me an example of what some of those resources might be? Like, do you deal with permit waivers or that kind of thing?
We can, we act as the interface with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that they're in the loop. In Washington State, like as you said, that the authority has been delegated to Washington Fish and Wildlife from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to act in their stead. We make sure that they have the supplies they need, the equipment that's required, making sure that we're going through that process to make sure that all the expenses are covered and that kind of thing. Making sure that the paperwork is handled so that it gets billed properly through the response, so that if we're ordering one of the response trailers, for example, I'm dealing with the paperwork that's required to make sure that equipment gets moved to the proper location, that it gets billed to the proper vendor, that sort of thing. It's the administration kind of behind it.
Would you see yourself as, or the branch director as the person who would speak on behalf of wildlife response, say at a press conference, or would you help draft messaging to include in a press release?
Of course, that's certainly another part of our duties in that role. We represent the 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 main trustee in this case, which is Fish and Wildlife, Washington Fish and Wildlife, and speaking on behalf of the entire wildlife response process. Um, Again, to act in I guess, our trust responsibility as an agency to sort of take on that role and to be that face during a response.
Yeah, I was reading. I don't know if you've read this book. Scott Knudsen turned me onto it. Nastucca, A Spill Turns Creative.
I have not.
A
No.
No, it's about the Stucco barge spill. This predates Exxon Valdez by a little bit,
Yeah,
and
1989. Yeah.
yeah, off the coast of Grays Harbor. And some of the biggest impacts were state park lands, Forest Service lands. Under those kind of circumstances, where the biggest uh, impact is, say, the Washington State Parks Department, would they be brought into the wildlife branch, or would they be brought in at some other level? Would you include these other trustees in the branch?
They certainly would be welcome to participate. I would suspect that their primary connection would be through the environmental unit and serving as a trustee there, to helping to identify resources at risk in general. The wildlife branch is more sort of the practical aspects of wildlife impacts and dealing with the, the process of trying to recover and rehabilitate those animals. So it's not it's very focused on the wildlife side of things.
What are some of the other positions that would be staffed in the command post within the branch?
So besides the branch director, there's a deputy. There's typically a liaison role that serves as the to help sort of coordinate with the other sections in the response. We'll often have a documentation person. It just really varies, and it depends on the incident itself, where we're needed. Um, we also will typically have a representative of the wildlife contractor to make sure that they're the ones doing the interaction between um, the branch and their personnel in the field or in their rehabilitation center. And we'll also typically have a representative of the responsible party to be engaged and to see how we're doing things.
And get them to sign the 213 RRs.
Well, usually usually that goes up to the ops chief, but yes.
Somebody's got to authorize the funds,
That's
right?
right.
So, what do you see as maybe the biggest challenge in wildlife response? Is it remote locations? Is it the siting of a rehabilitation center? What do you think?
Well, I think it certainly can vary between incidents. One of the big challenges we face is just is trying to get across the point that the wildlife response moves at a different pace than the rest of the incident response. It usually takes longer to ramp up, and then it will persist for typically much longer than the rest of the cleanup activity. So in those early days when the rest of the operations section is, spreading, putting out boom and running skimmers and that sort of thing, we're typically just acquiring resources, getting the equipment set up, getting the rehab center established. Um, but then it may go on for weeks or months after everybody else has gone home, because you'll still have wildlife in care going through the rehabilitation process. The actual siting of the centers anymore really isn't quite as much of an issue as it had been historically. We've got a lot more equipment, much of it mobile now, that can be set up as we need to, and it's easier to find locations to do that. We've actually pre-vetted a number of locations around the state, where there is uh, adequate water and power, uh, support facilities for personnel, that kind of thing. So that really isn't as much as a limiting factor as it used to be.
There is a philosophy that I agree with, that citing the actual rehabilitation center really should be out of the spill zone, somewhere where you're not competing with other responders for housing, for supplies, and whatnot. How uh, rather than having the location, right there next to the command post or something like that. What are your thoughts?
I agree with that. The limiting factor for the rehabilitation center isn't so much the for the animals; it's for the personnel support. If you've got a large incident, you can have potentially hundreds of workers within that facility, and in a remote location that can put quite a strain on the local resources, especially if we're competing with the cleanup uh, activity and workers that are going to have to be there on location. In that case, it's much easier to move the animals than it is to move the people. So we'll tend to focus on setting up where we have the infrastructure to support a larger rehab center. Um, to sort of help offset that, we'll typically set up what are known as stabilization units in those more remote sessions spaces that are focused on kind of doing the immediate first aid that might be necessary, um, doing some gross cleaning of animals, feeding them, getting them warmed up, hydrated, to help sort of stabilize them, and then uh, move them back to the rehab center as we're able to.
So they might be in stabilization for 2, 3 days before you'd feel like they were healthy enough to transport. Would that be the case?
It's probably going to be much shorter than that. We would probably be moving them out of the stabilization trailer within a day, certainly. Um, and we'll set up regular transport runs between those facilities and the rehabilitation center. But it helps to kind of get the immediate needs of the animals met before we move them back to the center, where we've got more access to resources to support the overall effort.
So we have independent contractors like International Bird Rescue or Focus Wildlife, but Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife also owns some rehabilitation equipment, correct?
We do. Um, Most of it dates from quite a while ago. I think the trailer that we currently have we acquired in 2002, before a lot of this other infrastructure was in place, and it to a certain extent became redundant once industry started funding the acquisition of these mobile facilities that we currently have. The way that we now envision using the state resources is more of an additional uh, field command post or an extra stabilization trailer if it's necessary. It's an additional asset to use should the need arise, but it's not part of the planning standard that currently exists.
Yeah, we don't list it in our equipment cache, but how would we get a hold of it? Would the wildlife branch director call it out? Would ecology call it out? How do we get that resource?
Well, it's currently listed in the whirl. You'll have to help me on it.
Worldwide response
Response.
resource list. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it. So it's available for being called out. Typically, the wildlife branch director would order that as a part of the other resources that might be mobilized during a wildlife response. I should probably also mention that one of the other ways that we envision using this would be in the case of say a large outer coast spill where we might have some sort of an impact to the sea otter population that we don't currently have a lot of resources for. It might be something that we could use for that kind of a response to help keep the kind of the birds and marine mammals situations separated, because they obviously require much different care.
So the Department of Fish and Wildlife has got a really cool airboat that you guys were driving out at Grace Harbor during the large scale equipment deployment. You were out there for that, were you not?
I was, yes.
I didn't get to see the airboat really taken off. Tell me about the recon that you guys were exercising during the large scale equipment deployment.
So one of the ideas that's been kicked around for quite some time is the possibility of using airboats to do wildlife reconnaissance, wildlife assessment during spills in areas of particularly shallow water, such as the bays on the outer coast, Grays Harbor and Willapa Bay, and those sorts of places. So the idea came about to try to mobilize one of those airboats that the agency has, put some of our wildlife contractors on there, and take them out and just see what we could do with it. Get their thoughts about how how useful that kind of a platform might be.
And how
I
did
think
you
it was
feel it
pretty.
turned out? Was it successful?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a very niche tool, um, but for those kinds of environments, I think it could be potentially really useful to get out, be able to see uh, things that you might not be able to access otherwise, to be able to put people on the ground in very shallow areas where you might not be able to get to with a conventional prop-driven boat. Um, they are loud, so that it's certainly something that you'd have to take into account. But I think they would definitely have their place.
Is that something Fish and Wildlife would mobilize for on their own in the early stages of a response, or would you wait until there was a wildlife branch stood up and then order the resource?
We would mobilize that through the branch. One of the we don't really have the the resources to get out there in front of things like that. And we don't really want to be self-deploying. We want to be able to work from within the incident command system for any kind of a spill response.
How many of those boats do you have?
I think we currently have three in total, but the one in particular that was of interest is one that was acquired a few years ago by Fish and Wildlife under the Ecology Equipment Grant, um, and that part of the justification for that was the potential use of it during spill response, and that was essentially what we were demonstrating during the equipment drill, is the ability to put wildlife contractors in those areas.
No, that's great. That initial recall, I mean, that's part of the new regulation that we had to update all of our plans to cover.
Right.
And getting initial incident commanders and qualified individuals to recognize the need to quickly mobilize equipment to support the wildlife contractor in conducting the recon, to begin to plan for capture, is really important. I've worked with my response contractors and kind of set aside a thing that says, hey, we're going to need this other initial task force of vessels and a helicopter, totally to support the wildlife branch.
Wow. Okay. That's wonderful.
Well, it's a big, wildlife rehabilitation, is a thing that stands out to the public. It's a thing that the public really cares about. I mean, generally, oil spills are not injuring people, right? People aren't out there swimming around in the oil. They have a way of getting away from it in their boats and cars, but not birds, not otters, not seals, not whatever, right? They are on their
Right.
own.
Right. Well, and that's always been the case, but it hasn't always been reflected in the drills and responses that we've seen over the years. I mean, there's been quite a paradigm shift, I think, in that regard. So that's one of the positive things that I've seen come about over these years. Quite a change in that perspective.
Well, it's that oil pelican that makes it to the front page every time there's an oil spill, right?
Yeah.
Whether the oil spill is in Houston or Long Beach or Seattle or Valdez, that pelican gets around.
It does.
These are great, plans. One of my and I use this line in every training that I do, but I like it. It's from Dwight Eisenhower, who said, "The plan is nothing. To plan is everything." Just the act of planning. And I kind of think that conversations like this are part of that act of planning. It's, discussing how we're going to respond. And then we share this information with, people who might not have an opportunity to talk to a wildlife branch director in person. Right now, we get
Sure.
a little different perspective on how we go about dealing with that particular part of the response. Jenny at Focus Wildlife made this a pet peeve of mine, but it's become a pet peeve that we so often just focus on birds in drills. Like, hey, we're exercising wildlife, but birds only. Why is that what we do? I mean, what is the complication of exercising mammals in a tabletop exercise?
Well, I think part of it is that it dates back to, or it goes back to the idea that historically birds have been the the types of animals that have been most impacted, or at least most visibly impacted in responses. As you say, they're the ones that end up on the front page. Nestucca, you know, impacted tens of thousands of seabirds. Um, it's numerically, it's been what the focus has been about. It's been the most obvious, and because of that, most of the planning standards were originally developed around birds. Because that was the most difficult lift for everybody, was to say, okay, we're just going to focus on the primary species type here. And so when you look at the Northwest Area Plan, you're going to see a lot of references to oiled birds and the the resources that are necessary to pull together for an adequate response. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that it took such a lift, and it was a remarkable effort by many parties to make it happen, to get the equipment in place that currently exists within the Northwest. That there's a tendency to just allow that to be the main focus, I guess, when you're talking about different species, because they numerically are typically going to be less than the numbers of birds potentially that would be impacted. And I think the assumption, and rightly so, is that you'll be able to adapt to other species types uh, for the most part, if you need to, if you've got that larger equipment and resource list in place that's available to these wildlife contractors. It's going to be a more manageable response for them if say they start getting aquatic mammals in, that they'll be able to adjust as they need to deal with um, mink or otter, or beaver, those sorts of animals that we're not going to be seeing hundreds of them, most likely. But it's still part of the response, and it's still something that we need to kind of give some thought to. How would we deal with amphibians, or mammals, or any other number of species?
And Jenny had a great story about a response that was taken, that happened in Canada, where they had recovered a number of beavers. And generally, they build these pens, even for mammals, using plywood. But guess what? Beavers chew through plywood. So how do you house them? And and they don't like each other. They apparently they're you can't put them all in the same pen. So they ended up going out and getting metal horse trailers as the housing, and each beaver got its own little trailer condo.
The wildlife contractors that I know are certainly some of the most creative people that I've ever met. Being able to problem solve and come up with ways to adjust on the fly is certainly a part of their makeup, I think.
That's why they need to be as close to major hardware stores as possible, right? You walk in, it's like, all right, here's my problem. What can I use to solve this? I'll take all that PVC pipe over there. I need all the garden hoses. I'll take all those bins right there. Let's bring them on out. So should we be exercising something differently? Is focusing on mobilization for birds enough, or if you could be the drill design god for the day, what would you change about how we exercise wildlife in worst case tabletop exercises?
I guess I'd like to see us go uh, a bit deeper into the process in some ways. I mean, I feel like we've gotten pretty good at working say that day one exercise. You know, getting the initial resources ordered, getting the right people mobilized, but then um, moving beyond that, starting to 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 deal with more wildlife assessments, more um, personnel issues, more transportation issues, those sorts of things that I think I'm confident that we could adjust to, or that we could deal with now, but we really haven't gotten to the point where we're drilling it as much. But that said, I also know that the drills they're not designed necessarily for that. It's the larger picture that we're looking at here. We're trying to test the ability of a plan holder to implement their contingency plan, and that's a much broader plan than just wildlife. And so there has to be a certain amount of give and take in that system, I think, to make sure that we've got an adequate level of confidence that they're going to be able to implement the plan that's been approved by the Department of Ecology, and that it will support the resources and personnel that we need to move forward in the case of a large release.
Yeah, we typically exercise day one or maybe day one and day two, but it's really difficult to say, hey, we're going to do a 1 day drill and we're going to exercise day three. Because then the drill design team has to script everything that's happened in day one and day two, create a common operating picture that captures all of that information, develop the previous day's incident action plan as a place to kick off. And that is a lot of work.
It really is. Yeah. So I mean, I think we can criticize or lament not being able to test certain things, and I do it all the time. But I do think that if we're doing well in those early stages, we're going to set ourselves up for success moving down the road if we ever need to get to that point. By getting better at what we're doing now, I think it's always going to be helpful to us. Getting more efficient, getting more awareness, developing more better habits of communication. I think all these things are really important.
In a real event, you think we can get a wildlife branch stood up effectively on day one? I mean, certainly we're going to activate our wildlife response contractors and try to get them into the field to start the recon process. But what is available staffing coming out of Fish and Wildlife to staff the wildlife branch?
Well, I'm absolutely confident that we can get one stood up. Um, that we've got certainly a small team here, but we're pretty comfortable with the process. Starting that interaction with the command of the response, initiating the field activities of the wildlife contractors, getting the equipment ordered, finding the appropriate location for a rehab center, starting the assembly of that. So I think we're actually in pretty good shape there.
So, Brian, kind of in wrapping up, what do you think you'd like the listeners to really know about where we're at with wildlife response as opposed to maybe where we were at the time of Open 90?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me is that we've come a long way. Not that it wasn't on people's radar, but it was really difficult to sort of integrate the wildlife response with an oil spill response. Quite frankly, I mean, it was always sort of an add-on to it. And in the years that have gone by, I guess we've become much better at integrating it into a wildlife or into the overall spill response, making it a fixed part of the command post. And industry has been incredibly supportive, providing the equipment and the resources, the personnel that are needed to implement an effective wildlife response, and for that I'm really grateful.
Well, we'll be leaning on your expertise if, God forbid, we have to stand up a wildlife branch in earnest. Brian MacDonald, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Hey, I wanted to let you know about an ICS 300 level class that we're going to be teaching. By we, I mean Gallagher Marine Systems and Clean Rivers Cooperative in Portland, Oregon, November 8th, 9th, and 10th. We have a few seats left at $425 per person. Our lead instructor will be Randy Ashmore. This will be a FEMA certified course. So if you're interested in getting somebody signed up for this course, for some of the seats that are left, go to cleanriverscooperative.com/training and you can register there. Clean Rivers Cooperative's website, and you can register.